que ce n'est pas le mal, hein, mais le bien qui engendre, qui nourrit la culpabilité.
Jacques Lacan was a French psychoanalyst who reinterpreted Freudian theory through language, structure, and the logic of desire, becoming one of the most influential figures in 20th century. In his clinical practice, Lacan treated money not as a mere administrative detail, but as a crucial element of the analytic setting. He famously broke with standardized fees and introduced a flexible case-by-case approach, often determining the price according to what he called the subject's relation to desire. Hi, my name is Gabriel Felix. I'm a Latin American psychoanalyst, and today we're going to discuss the issue of money on a psychoanalysis. Money has been throughout our entire history as a human race. In ancient Greek, Aristotle and Nicomachean ethics have postulated that money would facilitate exchanges between commodities. In psychoanalytic terms, money plays a central role in the economic libido of the patient. Not only, the psychoanalyst is also paid with money. That makes Neuza Souza, who was a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, debate on the issue of money on a psychoanalysis. She believes that someone who undergoes a psychoanalysis must pay expensively. Her central question wonders about, is it possible to exchange money for a symptom? Or in her precise terms, is it possible to exchange a psychoanalysis for a symptom? Let's break down a little bit what we are conceptualizing as money. Let's take the perspective of Karl Marx upon it. Karl Marx was a philosopher who opposed to Hegel's idealism. He proposes a different methodology. He takes concepts deriving from reality and from historical processes. That being said, Karl Marx views money as a historical product of our society. To him, money derives from 4 different phases. The first phase is when a commodity that has no value of use to the seller has a possible value to a buyer. The buyer wants a commodity for its utility, whereas the vendoor does not want this commodity because the only value is present in the exchange. The formula Karl Marx postulates to this phase is X commodity equals Y commodity. That being said, a quantity of linen could be exchanged for such quantity of a coal, for example. At the second phase, the next phase, a simple commodity expresses its value in a series of other commodities. For example, a X quantity of linen equals to Y quantity of a coal, which equals to a W quantity of shoe, and it goes on. This stage broadens the exchange between commodities, but it's still a little fragmented. To derive this formula from reality, Karl Marx analyzed societies that still don't have a exceeding in terms of commodity production. In the next phase, the third phase, a commodity is taken as a reference. What Karl Marx is saying here is that the X commodity, the quantity of certain commodity, takes a role as a general equivalent to all different kinds of commodities. But to Karl Marx, this stage still hasn't reached its most perfected display of general equivalent. That only comes in practical use when gold, silver, or copper assumes this role. He analyzes different communities and societies, and he decides through a historical analysis that those were the items or commodities that were most frequently used to serve as a general equivalent. But still, why do a psychoanalysis must be expensively paid? Let's break down Neuza's thinking. If the symptom is a mechanism that protects the patient from ideas that are unsufferable or incompatible with the ego, and it takes time to be formalized or crystallized, and even it takes more time and energy, libido if you will, to maintain it, a psychoanalysis must be, in terms of cost, equivalent to all of this labor. We have to understand that to Karl Marx, a commodity is associated with the idea of expenditure of time embodied in a commodity. That being said, it's almost like we are taking a symptom as a commodity and we are exchanging it for money. More precisely, we are exchanging it for a piece of paper or coin. It is evinced in this line of thinking that Neuza is actually fighting against the metaphysics of money. But also, through Nietzsche's work, Human All Too Human, she says that if the patient does not pay with money, the patient pays with guilt, resentment, gratitude, or even envy. She also agrees with the analytical perspective Nietzsche has of philosophical systems. He argues that metaphysics is just a immature state of spirit of a researcher. Allegedly, to him, metaphysics is almost a immature zeitgeist. Nietzsche is interested in a historical or genealogical perspectivism, meaning the concepts varies throughout time and the need of a philosopher to think reality. Therefore, he strongly disagrees with the work of Immanuel Kant, precisely metaphysics of morals. He says morals are constructed historically and not a transcendent imperative, a categorical imperative, such as affirms Immanuel Kant. That being said, Nietzsche contributes to a question that often comes in the body of the psychoanalyst. Why do I feel guilt when I'm exerting my craft? Why do I feel guilt for charging someone who I'm helping? And also, if the patient does not pay me money, why does he feel guilt, envy, gratitude, or even resentment? When Nelson argues that the patient feels guilt, is because he feels in debt. And that is the contribution Nietzsche has to offer. To him, guilt, resentment, and envy is a different sign of the same kind regarding gratitude. When someone feels grateful, it doesn't necessarily mean that this person is thankful because he's a good person. But he feels in debt with someone who has done him a good favor, a good gesture, or a good action. They feel they need to pay back with kindness. But it all comes down to a conservation instinct. With guilt, resentment, and envy, Nietzsche says that the same mechanism is on display. The only difference is that resentment has been put in a different category, meaning the subject wants to pay back something that was awfully done to him, but he can't, and then he becomes resentful. In psychoanalytic terms, that could imply a termination of the psychoanalysis process. Regarding envy and guilt, the patient most frequently exposes it to the psychoanalyst, so he feels a little bit of pity. Regarding the guilt a psychoanalyst feels when helping someone through a psychoanalytic process, Neuser argues that that comes in two assumptions. The first one being, a psychoanalyst needs money to live. He is inside a capitalist society. Neuser also put that the psychoanalyst isn't exempt of having a desire, which she warns us. She says that the psychoanalysts indeed have desire. This desire will eventually be expressed within the clinical dispositive, but it cannot play a central role. The only desire that needs to play a central role is the patient's desire. Neuza also contributed to a clinical setting, or more precisely, the role money plays on the clinical structures. She argues that neurotics have a different relationship regarding money than psychotics. Breaking down even further, obsessionals feel like they are in debt, feel like that they are paying the psychoanalyst with money, and also because he doesn't really or necessarily want a symptom to be extinguished, extenuated, or alleviated. He is also paying when the unconscious manifests through his speech, free speech, in the forms of symptoms, praxis, lapses, and other manifestations of the unconscious. In this sense, he feels like the psychoanalyst also owes him. And this question, who owes who, plays a major role in obsessional. Money intervenes right at this moment. The obsessional feels like he can actually pay fully a psychoanalyst, but he eventually discovers that that is impossible. And this impossibility is associated with this tragical dimension, tragical symbolic dimension of debt in the economic libido of obsessional. The hysterical, on the other hand, or even, if you will, on the contrary, feels like they are being charged unfairly, because hystericals feel like they have been through so much with traumatic experiences, bad experiences. They feel like those experiences would justify no pain. Also, the hysterical attributes his own value according to the price of the session. A question that frequently is within the hysterical signifiers chain is, do I need him or did he need me? The psychotics have a completely different understanding of money. At times, a psychotic views money in a most enigmatic way. Such way, the psychoanalyst is incapable of translating in a symbolic dimension. At other times, psychotic views money as it is in a literal sense. The whole point for Neuza is, when you charge a patient per session, and you start to put money inside the signifier's chain of free speech. For example, the obsessionals feel like they can't really control a psychoanalysis. And because they can control paying, they might be hindered, or they might feel more inclined or forced to be more active on a psychoanalysis. The hystericals, on the other hand, through the psychoanalyst handling of the money, can impose this question that unsettles every hysterical. What is my value? Charging per session completely destabilizes the self-notion of value a hysterical has. To Neuza, this handling of the money is actually a great contribution for the patients. In both neurotic cases, the psychoanalyst could use money as an instrument, using it associated with the patient's singular desire. In the sense, she takes money on a case-by-case approach, respecting the individual's singularity, absolute singularity. The obsessionals are compelled to come back for more psychoanalysis because he loses control of it, whereas hystericals are compelled to understand her value to the other. And in terms of the psychotic structure, money could play also a good role. Because psychotic might schizonize the relationship with money, money could play the role of an index to analyze how much in contact with reality the psychotics are. But having money associated with the idea of the absolute singularity means that every patient that pays expensively for a psychoanalysis pays according to their own socioeconomic structure, meaning this not little is absolutely relative. It varies depending on the economic structure, the singularity of the patient, the effort a patient has in psychoanalysis, depending also on the intensity of the anxieties that emerge within a clinical dispositive. And that makes us wonder, how does money also intersect with politics? So my main goal here is to bring contributions from the Latin Africa context. In Brazil, due to social historical racism, classicist whiteness has an enormous impact on the relationship between psychoanalysts that differ from this profile and money. Some psychoanalysts that differ from this profile tend to even charge less money from patients who could afford more, and not charge communities that have a vulnerable status, due to the fact that sometimes those psychoanalysts identify themselves with the people that form these communities. The psychoanalyst might experience even guilt charging someone who almost has nothing to offer in return. And even regarding the fees of supervision, a psychoanalytic training, psychoanalysts that come from this background experiences a difficulty on sustaining this trajectory, and this often causes them to have less theoretical repertoire. So I want to know, in your country, in your territory, in your singularity as a cyclist, how do you handle money? Do you take consideration the social economic structure of the patient, the singularity? Do you take consideration the economic libido of the patient, and even the signifiers chain in his free speech? What are your difficulties with money on the matter of the clinic? Comment down below what you think. And maybe the next video I will bring a little bit of how politics and psychoanalysis are intersected. Follow for more.